Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. I see we've got quite a few people who have already logged in. We're just going to give it one more minute before we get started. All right, since we've have some early birds here, we're just going to go ahead and get started, and hopefully we'll get a few more to join us. But first off, my name is Matt Clark. I'm with Kindful, and I am on our partnership team. We are here in the Kindful offices, and I'm pleased to have Greg McRay and a couple of the other foundation group staff here with me today. So Greg McRay is the president and founder of the Foundation Group, a consulting firm also based here in Nashville, Tennessee, that since 1995 has successfully guided over 15,000 nonprofits through the IRS 501c3 process at a 100% success rate. And the Foundation Group also provides an ongoing expert formation and compliance services to thousands of nonprofits each year. So Greg, thanks for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about demystifying solicitations. And one of the reasons we're really excited to have Greg here and the Foundation Group to talk about this topic of demystifying solicitations is precisely because we understand there is a lot of complexity around the issue. And personally, I have spent some time diving into the realm of charitable solicitations out of necessity while working for a Tennessee-based organization that had donors in other states. And like the bad habit of cramming before a test, I wish I would have known more around the subject before sending out that fundraising letter. So, Greg, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Great, glad to be here, excited.
All right, so Greg, we're going to go through a few questions here today. I believe we have 9 questions, so it's going to be more of a Q&A. But for all of you who are listening in, obviously you're on mute only, but there's an option for you to type in questions in the right-hand panel of GoToMeeting. So please feel free to do that, and if time permits at the end, we will get to those questions. But for now, we'll get started. So the first question, let's get started, is what are charitable solicitation registrations?
That's probably a perfect first question to start with, but technically it is the process of registering with state government as a charity that has the intent to solicit donations. It's actually a little more complicated than that, but if an organization wants to be able to ask the public to support what they're doing through charitable contributions or any type of donation program, they're going to need to register with the state in most cases, and we'll get into the details of that in some other questions. But that is what the registration is basically you're getting on the approved list of the state that you're dealing with to be able to ask the public for donations. And it doesn't stop with just the organizations that are asking for donations. You know, it applies to charities, obviously, but it also applies to professional solicitors. So if you're someone that is a professional fundraiser for hire, you have a registration requirement. If you are fundraising counsel in a lot of states, if you're providing counsel regarding the subject of fundraising as a consultant, that usually triggers a registration requirement. If you're doing gaming type stuff, a lot of people overlook gaming. But if you're doing gaming, that triggers registration requirements. And also fantasy sports has now been pulled into that list of things as well.
Yeah. All right, so I guess leading into that, must a nonprofit register?
Generally, yes, but that depends on a number of factors. Number one, are you active as an organization? That's one of the first big factors. Are you actively operating? One of the second most obvious answers is if it's required, because not every state requires registration, and we'll get into that as well. But if it's required to register, obviously you must register. if you're not exempt, there are categories of organizations that don't have to register, but that's only true in certain states. And in addition to that, you may have a registration requirement to register as an organization that's not required to register in the future. So it's an exemption, and that gets a little bit confusing. But one of the big issues here is failure to file a registration if that's something that's required of you is painful. Most states have significant penalties that apply if an organization isn't properly registered. So the short answer is generally yes, but there's a lot of fine print details as to determine, which organization has to register and when.
Do you have an example of what one of those penalties might be?
It depends on the state quite a bit. Some states have significant penalties that rack up per day. Some states are a little more lenient and will forgive penalties. I'm not going to name states necessarily that are easy to work with. They may not want that known
Right.
because that might discourage compliance, but some states are very, very willing to waive penalties if an organization has the first intent to get it right. In other words, if an organization comes to the state and they're in arrears on filings or whatever else, there are certain states that are like, our biggest priority is we want you to get right, we want you to get registered properly, we'll let that go. Other states categorically don't even ask because they're not going to waive it.
All right. So one of the things you said is some nonprofits must register if it's required. So obviously the next question coming from that is, do I need to register? Oh, I think I skipped one. Oh, what constitutes a solicitation?
Great. Well, it's any ask for a donation, basically. So we're talking about fundraising letters, we're talking about fundraising events. So if you're holding an event, whether it's a golf tourney or a scramble or any other type of thing that you would categorize as event-based, but it doesn't stop there. It could be media solicitations, whether that's direct mail, radio, television. A lot of organizations are a lot smaller than what would normally be seen for media type things, but I think what a lot of people overlook is the indirect marketing or the indirect solicitation. And it could be just volunteers or your fan club of your organization that's out trying to generate interest, financial interest for the organization. All those things generally constitute a solicitation. One of the questions that we get constantly is regarding electronic solicitation.
Yeah, that would be a big one for us, for Kindful being a online software platform. So yeah, we're interested in this answer as well.
Yeah, and that's where you get into things such as donate now buttons on your website, whether you're using a contribution and tracking software like what Kindful is. But there was a set of principles put together several years ago by NASCO, that's the National Association of State Charity Organizations, and that's in conjunction with National Association of Attorneys General as well. And that's the collective group nationwide that actually governs these things. But they met in Charleston, South Carolina, and came up with what is called the Charleston Principles. And you can actually see that on our website and read that. It's a long read, but it's interesting. And it's not regulatory. These aren't rules, but it's generally agreed upon principles by the states on how they're going to deal with electronic solicitations. To kind of make it easy, the Donate Now button seems to be the most common thing, and it may be a PayPal button that you've got on your website or some other type of the ability for somebody to donate and check out through e-commerce. Well, generally, even if you have a Donate Now button on your site, that's going to trigger a registration requirement, particularly in the state that you are incorporated. If you're in other states, it may trigger it or it may not because there's other factors involved, and the Charleston Principles kind of lays that out. So really, it's not so much that it's a uniform set of rules as it is sort of a collective group of principles that these states are agreeing to operate by as of right now. But the more simple answer is, if you are a California corporation, California nonprofit with a Donate Now button on your website, at a minimum, you almost certainly have a registration requirement if that's the only solicitation you did, at least in California. one of the other things that constitutes a solicitation that people ask about is the passive gift. So we get questions all the time. If I'm a Tennessee nonprofit and somebody from Kansas sends me a gift, sends us unsolicited, yeah, they send us a contribution. Does that gift alone, trigger, does that gift alone trigger a registration requirement? Mm-hmm. Not necessarily, but it's how you respond to that gift that determines whether a registration requirement gets triggered for Kansas. Let's take that example. So you're a Tennessee organization, somebody in Kansas finds out about what you're doing, loves what you're doing, sends you a check for $1,000. You didn't solicit in the state, you have no activity in the state, it was a passive way that they found out about us. So great. So obviously you're probably going to send this person a contribution statement or a thank you letter. Right. Still great. But the minute that you go further than that, you add them to your newsletter list and your newsletter contains an ask, or your thank you letter contains something that could be construed as an ask as well for future gifts, you just started soliciting in the state of Kansas.
Right. So a standard receipt with no additional ask is still in compliance. Once I take that next step, maybe including a solicitation on the receipt or sending them a follow-up, that would require the charitable solicitation.
Yep, pretty much.
All right. So one of the questions, I guess, leading into that is, do I need to register for charitable solicitations before I begin fundraising?
The answer to this one is yes, with an exclamation point. That is the one thing that is probably the most uniform across the states, is the requirement to register prior to asking anybody for a donation.
So I can't wait till that first gift rolls in from that other state if I sent out a solicitation ahead of time.
If you sent out a solicitation ahead of time. There is one small exception to that, and this gets confusing as well. California actually has a weird rule that you register within 30 days of receiving any assets into the organization. So they kind of treat it a little bit differently. But across the states that have registration requirements, it is expected that you register prior to solicitation. But, what gets interesting about this is it's not just as simple as registering for charitable solicitations with these states. What a lot of people miss is the reality that that's not the only organization in that state they're probably going to have to deal with. If you're going to register for charitable solicitations in a state outside of your own, almost all of those states require you also to get what's called a certificate of authority first from the corporations division. So let's take the Kansas example. Let's say you're going to have to register there. You're going to need to get a certificate of authority to operate a Tennessee corporation in Kansas, even though you don't have a physical presence there. The fact that you're soliciting triggers not only a charitable solicitation registration requirement, it also triggers a certificate of authority requirement, a registered agent for that state, and an annual report that would have to be filed. And this is with the corporations division. Usually that has to happen prior to the registration. So it's not just one thing, it's actually two things in most states. I think there's only 3 states, talking to our compliance director, Shannon, I think there's only 3 states that don't have a certificate of authority requirement that precedes even the charitable solicitation registration requirement.
Wow. All right. So I think one of the things that I keep thinking of as we're talking is you mentioned some states in some cases and most states in some cases, and it leads me to the question of, well, why isn't it the same everywhere? But what states require charitable solicitation registrations?
Including the District of Columbia, there are 42.
All right.
So there are only 8 jurisdictions that don't have any registration requirement whatsoever. So if anybody listening happens to be in these states, it's a shorter list to list. But Delaware, Idaho, Indiana, Iowa, Montana, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Wyoming. Those states do not have a formal registration requirement. So solicitations can happen pretty much at will in those states. But there's no uniformity at all to the 42 jurisdictions that require this. 8 of the states that require it make you have 501c3 approval before you can even register to solicit. So one of the questions we get, we work so much in the formation realm, we help over 1,000 nonprofits every year get started. To a one, 999 of those clients are going to ask us, can we start raising money yet?
Right.
That's not a simple yes or no. In some states, it's yes, but in some states, it's absolutely no. You can't even register until you get 501c3 approval, and that's true in 8 states. 18 states require you to have at least applied for 501c3 status. You don't have to have gotten it yet, but you have to have applied for it already. 13 states have no 501c3 requirement, so basically they don't care what the IRS has said one way or the other. If you're going to ask for money, you got to register. Right. If you're pretending to be a charity, you have to register for charitable solicitations. And there are 4 states that don't have general registration requirements, but they kind of have an odd one-off or one category. Arizona, for example, used to have full-blown charitable solicitation registration. They're one of the only times we've ever seen where a state actually eliminated all that, and the only registration requirements they have now are for veterans organizations and professional solicitors. Louisiana and Vermont both have registration requirements for professional solicitors only, and Texas technically has none unless it's a law enforcement group of some kind. So, but of the organization or of the states we're talking about, the vast majority are going to require a registration, certainly prior to solicitation. The bigger issue that comes up here, though, and the one that we deal with constantly, is the whole multi-state question. And this kind of goes back, we kind of alluded to that when we were talking about the Tennessee and Kansas example. But the question we get oftentimes is, do I need to register in all states? Well, maybe, maybe not, probably not for most, especially most smaller charities. That's a daunting requirement when you start looking at 42 jurisdictions, every one of those jurisdictions having a different set of rules as to who has to do it, when they have to do it, what's required to file it. Mm-hmm. And when you start looking at everything that's involved in meeting all those criteria. But is there a chance that your charity is going to need to register in 5 states, 10 states, 15 states? Absolutely. If you are meeting the threshold definition of solicitation in that state, you need to be registered in that state, and probably prior to any ask that's involved. You know, the best practice advice that we can give on that is to really, if you're an active organization that is soliciting, and even if you're not soliciting in, you don't think you're soliciting in states, take a look at where you're receiving your gifts from. And if you really are receiving contributions from a multi-state environment, take a look at where you're getting most of your contributions from. And if you're going to have a multi-state registration requirement, because it can be daunting, it's a good idea to triage those. You know, if you don't have the financial resources or the wherewithal to tackle all 15 states at once, for example, triage that, and at least over a short period of time, try to knock out the ones that are going to be the most problematic for you if you're not doing it right. Yeah. Where are you getting the most solicitations from? Yeah. But multi-state is one of the biggest issues we deal with. Okay.
And for any Kindful listeners that are on this webinar, that's you'd be able to run a query within your Kindful database to check, you know, run a report of show me all donations from 2016 and be able to see what states those are coming from. One of the other things, you know, piggybacking off that question, and you know, I think you may have tipped your hat a little bit to this question that's on the screen now, but say my organization is bigger and we are getting donations from all these 42 states and DC. Is there a way for universal registration?
Well, no. There was
if only.
If only. There was an attempt at this. And it was called the URS, or the Unified Registration Statement. Now, this was a joint project by the organizations that I mentioned a few minutes ago, NASCO and NAG, National Association of State Charity Organizations and National Association of Attorneys General. Those two groups really work hand in hand in this area of charitable solicitation and registration. And they put together something called the Multistate Filer Project in the mid-2000s. And this was an attempt to address this very concern. If you have an organization that needs to register in 5, 10, 15, 20, maybe 42 jurisdictions, the idea was, let's come up with a unified registration application, a one and done, so that people can fill this out. They're not burdened with 42 different ways of doing this. Problem was, it just didn't work out the way that it was planned. Not all states adopted it, so you had definitely less than the 42.
Okay.
I think the most was ever, I'm looking at some of my staff here, 30-something, if that, 30-something, if that ever signed on to the unified registration statement. But none of those jurisdictions, except maybe one or two, ever got rid of their own filing documents. So it was either or. If you were going to file in Georgia, you could use the URS or you could use the Georgia form. The problem that came about was, number one, it was a paper filing, so there was no electronic version of it. Not all the states accepted it, as we said, but also none of them were happy just getting the URS. So yes, you could prepare the URS, but they also wanted addendums that were particular to that state. Tennessee had their own additional requirements to be filed. All these other states had their own additional requirements. So in the end, it actually didn't make it easier. It actually made it harder. And it did not eliminate the fact that all these states had different filing deadlines, thresholds for filing, all the things that are true right now as far as what triggers thresholds, types of organizations that have to file, types that are exempt, all that still differed. So even though you theoretically had one application that would cover most of the states, none of the rules were the same.
Right.
And all of them had additional filing requirements on top of it. So as a result, it just fell apart.
Okay.
That whole process fell apart. Now, there is currently underway a new project.
All right.
Also
I like the sounds of this.
Also sponsored by NASCO and NAG, and this is meant to be an electronic platform that is supposed to be dynamic, so it's smart. As you start filling out the information, it understands where, well, that's the plan, is it understands what state you're registering in, and it pulls in addendum information to ask based on what those states offer. So it's a very dynamic app that they're talking about developing. There's 13 pilot states, including Tennessee, involved in this project. This is a massive undertaking, and it's been, I think, slower than they would like to have seen to make progress. There's no beta apps or anything like that yet. From what we see and from our contacts and who we talk to, this is still a long way off. If it ever comes to fruition, it will make this process a lot more straightforward. It doesn't necessarily make it a do-it-yourself project, but it will make it more straightforward. But right now, as it stands, this is still very much a file per state situation.
All right. Well, here's hoping that that does come to fruition. Moving on, I think the next question is, okay, so I've registered in a state. I'm continuing on. My next thought is, how often do I need to keep doing this?
Well, I would love to be able to say that this is a one and done situation because this is not an easy process to file. A lot of people assume that this is sort of like filling out articles of incorporation or something. You know, how hard could it be to register for solicitations? It's got to be like a one-page deal, right? And it isn't. It's a substantial filing that can often resemble something that's akin to applying for 501c3 status or filing the 990. So the original registration even includes a lot of information about the organization and its financial activity. Well, unfortunately, the renewal of that, it's not a one and done, and the renewal, with the exception, I think, of Georgia, which is biannually, the renewal is annual in all of these jurisdictions. And in almost none of them is it a one-page filing that says, hey, we're still here and we want to register for the next year. In almost all of these jurisdictions, the renewal process is the exact mirror image of the original registration. So it is a significant undertaking, and it doesn't just stop, unfortunately, after the first year. And the fines can rack up. One of the things that Shannon in our office was sharing with me was, for example, the state of South Carolina. They've got a $10 a day penalty for being late on your renewals that can go up to a max of $2,000. And that's just for not renewing the registration, and they won't forgive that. So, you know, one of the things that's also got to be included in these renewals, unless you're an organization that falls in one of these exempt categories, is full financials. Now, some states will accept the Form 990 that you file with the IRS in lieu of financials. Some states want a copy of the 990 plus their own financial statements filled out, and some just want their own financial statements filled out. What gets even more difficult on this annual thing is, for organizations that are represented here and listening that are, they understand the Form 990 and what has to happen there. A lot of people understand this threshold of $50,000 in revenue and below is able to file the Form 990N with the IRS, the e-postcard, very easy. There's a handful of states, though, that require a full 990, at least a 990EZ to accompany the renewal, even if you've only got $25,000 in revenue. Or one state state of Massachusetts is $5,000. So you could be a $5,000 gross revenue organization that has to have prepared a Form 990EZ just to be able to re-register for charitable solicitations. So this stuff doesn't get easy.
Wow. So before the webinar started, we sent out an email and asked if anyone had any questions beforehand that they wanted to cover. And this next question that I wanted to go over with you came from one of our listeners today. You know who you are, so thank you. But it does seem that there's these requirements change frequently across the country. You've mentioned that the URS was available and it wasn't, or isn't really accepted. So it seems like the rules change quite often. Is there somewhere that you would point someone to keep up with all of this?
Yeah, I mean, in states that you're registered in, one of the most obvious places to try to keep up with this is going to be on the Attorney General's website, if you happen to be in a state that the Attorney General's office is the one that handles charitable solicitations. And that's not true in all states. In some states, it's the Secretary of State. So, and that's true in the state of Tennessee. So it could be the AG's website, it could be the Secretary of State's website. There are third-party organizations that have information out there as well. Probably the best place is to rely on your service provider, whether you've got a CPA doing this for you, whether Foundation Group's doing this for you, or somebody else. Really, a service provider, especially in a multi-state environment, multi-state filing environment, is probably going to be the best to be able to advise you in a more concise way on how to stay compliant with all this. But short of the regulatory governmental websites, there aren't many places at all that you're going to see a collapsed view of the entire jurisdiction landscape, for example. Okay. There's not one place we've ever been aware of where you can log on and see this is the consolidated information you could ever want to know about 42 states. That doesn't exist that I'm aware of.
Yeah, well, thankfully we have you and the Foundation Group to help with that. So great. It looks like we've gotten a few more questions while the webinar has been going on. We kind of chatted about this just a little bit before, and the way this is what are the most problematic states to make sure to cover first. So maybe not problematic, but what are the most complex, I guess, states to make sure that you're taken care of if you're an organization that's,
I'm going to look to my team over here.
That note I gave you always stated.
Yeah, the one I was passed a note by my team here that I need to make sure that I mention. They're going to jump on me if I don't. But one of the things that we didn't say about this multi-state environment is most of the time you're not going to be able to register in a second state if you haven't already registered in your state of incorporation. So just assume for all practical purposes that comes first. If you're a Tennessee corporation, register in Tennessee first. If you're California,
even if you're not soliciting.
Yeah, even if you're not soliciting, that's going to be true. Problematic states, gosh, Massachusetts has to top the list because their requirements are so onerous. We talked about that $5,000 threshold. They have to provide at least a pro forma version of the Form 990EZ. Even if you don't file it with the IRS, you're going to have to file it with the state of Massachusetts. And having that $5,000 threshold, we have seen organizations that have four-figure revenue that end up spending anywhere from 10 to 20% of the revenue annually just to have a 990 prepared just so they can stay registered for solicitations. So that's a difficult state. Washington, D.C. is probably even worse than that.
Wow.
Because their factors involved in what constitutes a filing requirement and just some of the stuff that they're looking for. And DC makes it extremely difficult for third-party consultants like us to be able to assist a client to register in those states. That's not true across the vast majority of the landscape of states involved in this, but for DC, DC is really, really, really tough.
Okay.
Illinois has statute.
Illinois is another one.
The late filing, it's actually written in the statute.
Yeah, Illinois is another one that has state requirements that the filing or the penalties associated with not filing can't be waived. It's actually written into state law that those penalties cannot be waived. So if you get sideways with the state of Illinois, there's not even the ability to appeal for grace because it's a statutory issue. They're going to nail you with fines.
This is another question that was submitted that we covered briefly, and we didn't get into too much detail with it. But since this is on the nonprofit to be proactive about registering, what are some examples of the penalties or risks in engaging in this without registering, or in solicitations without registering?
Well, I'll tell you one of the most embarrassing ones because I think this will make it clear. There were several years ago, and this was I was in our living room at home, walking by the television. The 10 o'clock news is on, and as I'm walking by, I just happened to notice the logo of a client we're working with above the shoulder of the anchor.
Uh-oh.
My first reaction was, this probably isn't good. And turns out this was a veterans organization that had gotten sideways with the Tennessee Department of Charitable Solicitations. And this was a new client. They had just engaged us to help them get caught up on some things. We literally had engaged with them just a few days prior to this. But they got fined $5,000 for 5 different penalties each, and ended up on a name and shame on the 10 o'clock news as an organization that was because they held a big fundraiser. And some of the different things that they were doing, they were not registered, had several other violations that they had done, and somebody, because this was a visible fundraiser, not only did the Department of Charitable Solicitations publicize it, but it actually ended up making the news.
Right.
So that might be an extreme example, but it's one that happened inside our own walls that we've seen. But the thing is, one of the hallmarks of being a legitimate charity is operating in compliance and in transparency.
Right.
And this is not a risk that's worth taking. If you're not properly registered, not only can it be financially painful, but it can be embarrassing to the legitimacy of your organization to be out there doing things in a public manner that are flagrantly violating what the regulatory requirements are. Is this stuff a hassle? You better believe it. It is not easy to be compliant on some of these things. I mean, there's a lot of work involved. The rules are different, and for those of you that are running charities that do have a multi-state presence, or at least a multi-state fundraising presence, yeah, it's not easy. I mean, we won't pretend that it is, but operating sort of under the theory of, I'm going to do this till I get caught, that's not a theory that's probably going to play out real well.
And probably not one that sits well with your donors.
I mean, the last thing you want to do is have to answer for your donors, or answer to your donors for getting in trouble. And one of the things, too, that donors are getting a lot more sophisticated about, and this is what a lot of charities don't think about. If you think about your buying habits right now, if you're going to go buy a television, you're not just going to immediately run down to Walmart or Best Buy. Chances are you're going to research this on the web. I mean, everybody researches everything now. Well, they're researching your charity, too. And all of these states have the ability for potential donors to log on to the Charitable Solicitations website of that state and see if you're legitimately registered. All it takes is somebody looking you up and seeing that you're not registered for them to file a complaint with the state. And that scenario right there is actually where we see more charities get in trouble that haven't properly registered, is they get turned in by somebody in the public that says, hey, this organization over here is about to do a big fundraiser.
Yeah.
They've got a big fundraising campaign going on, or they're soliciting in my community. I looked them up on the website. They're not on the state's website as an approved charity. They file a complaint, and the next thing you know, you're getting hate mail from the state about why you're operating illegitimately.
We want to avoid that. I thought of a question too that was specific to my organization at the time, and I think the one thing that I researched heavily at the time. So I had an email list that I had. I had just started working with this nonprofit, and we didn't have a lot of information about our donors. So I wanted to send out an email asking for money, not knowing where some of these people were. So using your example from earlier, I'm based in Tennessee. I send out an email. I don't know that it goes to someone in Kansas, and then they make that gift. At what point does the state of Kansas say it's okay, now you can register? Or is it backdated to when I initially sent that first email?
Yeah. Yeah, most states are going to work with you on that. That's not necessarily an easy answer. And then there's also the question of, you know, what is the domicile of an email address? So, you know, if you moved from Kansas to Vermont to New York to Connecticut, chances are you didn't change your email address.
Right.
So, you know, it goes back to I think there's kind of a difference between the regulatory answer and the practical answer. Is the state of Kansas going to know that Bob Smith in Kansas got an email and you actually thought Bob was in Arkansas? You know, so it's hard to say there, but most of the states in those situations are going to be reasonable to work with you. And let's say, for example, I think the better way to answer this is if you became aware that, ooh, you know, we're soliciting in Kansas, didn't realize that we really need to register there. If you go about doing that registration, chances are any mess up that you've done over the last few months is not likely going to be visible anyway. So the bigger answer is if you know you're not doing it right, get it right.
Yeah,
that's
take
the
care
thing.
of it.
As soon as you're aware that you have a requirement, don't waste time getting that taken care of.
Great. Well, thank you for that answer and for all of your other answers. We have one question from the audience coming in here about thresholds of those, if you want to answer that.
Yeah, and it also depends on dollar amount thresholds too, and that's going to vary state to state. Again, this is not anything that's uniform, but some states may consider a gift to be so minimal that they're not worried about it. So, you know, if you're only receiving $5 from the state of Kansas, maybe not. So that's very dependent on a state-by-state basis.
All right, Greg, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. Very helpful. For all of you listeners out there, we have a survey link in the chat that we'd love you to fill out, or please continue to email us at Kindful or Greg and the team at the Foundation Group. Their website is 501c3.org, a fantastic URL that they have. So please go to that website, look up more information there. Check out Kindful if you are unfamiliar, and let us know if you have any additional questions or feedback on this webinar. Let us know if you liked it, if you want more like them. And again, Greg, thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt.
And thank you all for attending.